nature is more powerful than technology. And nature is coming back into cities whether we like it or not.
You said 90% of people are going to live in cities by 2080. That sounds like a lot of problems with affordable housing.
The ideas about, permanent population growth and permanent economic development, I think we have to revise all of that and start to think differently.
Greg Clark is a world expert on cities, urban investment, and the sustainable urban transition. Over a career of 35 years, he's advised more than 300 cities. His wide expertise covers city development, mobility, technology, digitization, innovation, city strategic planning, and real estate. He's the author of over 10 books, 100 reports on cities, and his next book, The Century of Cities, is due for publication in spring of this year. Welcome to the show, Greg.
It's great to be here, Tom, and thank you for the invitation.
I think it's going to be wonderful to talk about the future of cities, but let's kick off with the question I always ask people, which is for your wildest prediction of the future.
So here we go, Tom. I would like to propose this. By 2080, that's 55 years away, there will be more than 10 billion human beings. That's us lot. And almost 90% of us will be living in cities and in urban areas. Our human race will have completed a long trek to becoming an urbanized species. And by 2080, we should add, the human population will have reached its numerical peak as well.
There's a lot in that. So you're thinking about 3 billion more people, almost nobody living in the countryside, and then everyone starting to kind of die. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that what will happen is our population will stabilize. Of course, there are other disruptors we could have, Tom. Climate change, geopolitical conflicts, pandemics could make all of this human peak happen more quickly. But the optimistic estimations are that it will be 2080, we'll get to about 10.2 billion, and then we'll go through what is often seen in rich countries, that we stop having as many babies, we live a little bit longer, and eventually the total population will stabilize, and then it will begin to decline. And how fast that decline occurs is going to be very important. So we won't be dying more quickly, but we will be having many fewer babies.
So this is kind of a strange way to put it, but is this like a sad thing? I mean, like for most of my life, we've been worried about there being too many people, and too many people is definitely a bad thing. But now we're talking about having fewer people. That kind of seems somewhat suboptimal.
Yes, it's really strange, isn't it? Because for the next 55 years, Tom, we're still growing. Our population is growing. We'll get to that 10.2, 10.3 billion. Many of the new population will be in Africa and in Asia. Many of our new cities will be built there. But once we get to 2080, yes, we'll start to decline numerically as a species. And I think you're right. That's going to feel very different when we suddenly realize that there are fewer people next year than there were this year and all of that. But that also provides us, I think, with an opportunity. So I don't see this either as a happy thing or as a sad thing. It's rather something to be managed. We've got to manage the next 55 years as population grows. We've got to build cities that are adaptable and sustainable. And then as population begins to decline, we've got to figure out how to allocate population appropriately in order to maintain our world in the best condition it can be in. So it's a bit of a quest. I think it's a bit of a frontier of discovery. Let's put it that way.
It's sort of fascinating how it changes or sort of flips over some of the assumptions we make about life. I'm not an economist, but I think about half of GDP growth is often actually just population growth. So this idea that one can assume that the economy grows just because there are more people, suddenly we're kind of dealing, I guess not with scarcity, but a different way of thinking about growth.
I think that's absolutely right. And we have to think differently, not just about growth, but also about settlement patterns and transport and energy uses and food production and other things we might discuss. But if you think of it today, let's just take 55 years before the date I'm talking about. So already 58% of people live in cities. So roughly, we've got 58% there. 80% of GDP is produced in cities, and the reason is that cities are really economically productive. but 70% of carbon emissions also come from cities. So we're kind of trapped in this high productivity, but high energy use. And all of this is happening in only 1.2% of the world's land mass. So cities have this kind of super concentration power, which is good for the economy. It's good for meeting your future spouse, if that's what you want to do. It's good for creating culture and technology and medical discovery and all of that. But this concentration superpower is also bad for inequality. It can be bad for health. It can be bad for affordability, and it can be bad for quality of life. So all of the things that we've grown up with, and I may be a little bit older than you, Tom, but the things that we've grown up with, the ideas about, permanent population growth and permanent economic development, I think we have to revise all of that and start to think differently.
This movement from the sort of countryside, so to speak, to cities, is that something that's happening in every single type of economy? In a sort of privileged position like ours, we're constantly talking about people working from home and everyone going to the countryside so they can have more kids and a dog and do things by Zoom. How is the distribution of this movement happening?
As you say, quite rightly, the use of new technology is enabling us to have different relationships with where we live, how we work, how we shop, and that's giving more choice. In North America, that's producing a little bit of population decline in the top cities, but it's producing population growth in the second and third and fourth tier. And if you like, towns are becoming cities, right? So that's good. In Europe, we're seeing more of a metropolitanization. Those of us who can work remotely are making choices about quality of life, and we might be choosing to live a little bit further away from the city. So we might have an urban job, but live in a rural home. So that's quite interesting. But at the same time, people are moving into city centres. And then in the rest of the world, we're seeing very different patterns. So in the Middle East, the rapid growth of cities, and you and I first met in Riyadh. So we've seen what's happening in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh and in Doha and the other cities, massive growth. Southeast Asia is very similar. And of course, China has just been through this process of very, very rapid urbanization. So all of the eyes are on Indonesia, India, and Africa. What kind of urbanization process are they going to have? And how are they going to use these technologies? And will it result in these very high density cities? Or will it result in cities that are a little bit more spread out in just the way you suggest? So all I want to say about this is that slightly different things are happening in each part of the world. And although we've got some nice choices in Europe and in North America about perhaps using technology to enable us to do things differently, many other countries are not there yet. And the long-term effects of these technologies is not yet clear. So I'm afraid there's a little bit of uncertainty in all of this.
What's the relationship like between urban and rural in the future?
People tend to think of urban and rural as sort of opposites, and people like me tend to really oppose that way of thinking. We think of an urban-rural continuum, as it were, where there are a series of relationships. So on the one hand, people are generally moving from rural to urban areas, as you described, and some people are making the choice to move back to rural areas, depending upon where they are in their life cycle, especially in the advanced economies. So you have seen, for example, rural areas gaining population, both in North America and in Europe, after the pandemic. And you make the point very well. And some people have a chance to do that. But in much of the world, people are leaving the rural areas in order to go to the urban areas, either for jobs or for services or to meet other people. And those rural areas therefore end up with three roles. Either rural areas are being managed as ecological ecosystems which are producing the oxygen that we all need. So you're seeing approaches to that, for example, in Latin America. Or the rural areas are becoming huge farms producing the food that we need and creating all of the nutrients that are required. Rural areas are also increasingly becoming places of the production of energy. So solar farms have obviously become a very big aspect of this. So have wind farms and others. So that's a key area. And what we begin to see, and you'll see this certainly in Africa and India emerging, is wilderness experience. experiences that people really want to have. So if you like, agriturismo in the way that we think of it in Europe is not just a European idea about how we start to enjoy Tuscan villages and various parts of Spain and France again, but it's also an idea that has a kind of global resonance too. So we are seeing kinds of rural development that are about serving urban populations with experiences that you simply can't get in the city.
It's always fascinating to me how much kind of discourse in the world generally just assumes that everyone lives in an urban area. You know, if you ever read about a tech startup that gets funding, if you ever read about political decisions, you know, we've kind of already, you know, as someone that came from the English countryside, it really sort of hits me that we never think about that population.
Can I just mention something about that, though, Tom? Because I think it's a good point. So it is the case, whether we like it or not, that cities are really efficient places for certain kinds of activity. And one of the activities that they're really efficient for is enterprise. And the reason is that we have this ability in cities to do what we call linking, matching, and learning. In other words, if you bring together lots of entrepreneurs, then that attracts lots of investors. And the more the investors are there, the more the entrepreneurs are attracted. So you get this kind of acceleration effect where the entrepreneurs and the investors know they can all meet each other in Brooklyn or in Herzliya or in one of the downtowns in Dubai. And as a consequence, these things have a self-reinforcing kind of effect. So it is the case that most of the high growth startups are going to be founded in cities, but they might be founded by brilliant people who come from the rural areas too. So cities work very well for these kinds of things.
So many things to talk about. I'm feeling very negative here, so let's focus on some of the problems of this stuff. If you said 90% of people are going to live in cities by 2080, you know, that sounds like a lot of problems with affordable housing. It sounds like lots of problems with transportation. How do we get food around? It sounds like a lot of wealth inequality. You know, what should we be thinking about now and trying to plan ahead for?
Well, I think the way to frame this firstly is to say that, you know, the human race is in a kind of pact with cities. We've decided that the advantages of cities outweigh the disadvantages, and those advantages are the social, the economic, and the environmental and the cultural ones we've described. But there clearly are these disadvantages. And so let's just take food to begin with. We are going to have to get much better at urban farming and producing food within cities. We are going to have to really take care of our rural areas if they're going to feed these very large urban populations. We will have to advance agri-technology, and we'll have to be very frugal with our water supplies. And of course, there will be the frontiers of synthetic food production. We will have to be interested in that. So cities will produce more of the food that the people who live in cities consume, but they will never be able to produce all of it. So we're going to have to be great stewards of the countryside as we urbanize. So that's one. Housing is obviously the very, very big challenge that every growing city around the world faces. And to put it at its most simple, Tom, the population growth in our cities has outstripped the housing growth in our cities. And as a consequence, there's been an inflation. Now, there are lots of things that governments can do by, you know, making planning easier, providing more land, helping people to finance housing. But in the end, you've just got to build more homes. And that means you've probably got to build more homes at a lower average cost. So we are seeing, for example, in India and Africa, where this is going to really matter, new models of how you can produce homes that are safe, sanitary, clean, with all of the utilities that they need, but at a much lower cost. So the idea that we've got used to in the rich countries of the North, that our home is somehow our pension pot, or it's somehow our, you know, our long-term saving plan, we really need to work our way out of that conundrum, because the more we're stuck with the idea that our home is our financial future, the more we'll block people out of owning homes that we think might detract from the value of ours. So we have to move into seeing housing as an amenity that everybody is entitled to, not just a source of wealth for individuals and families. And of course, in some countries, this is happening more quickly than others. So we have big challenges there. Transport, I think we can be much more optimistic about. The problems, it seems to me, here are not so acute. Technology is really helping us to produce shared transport, sometimes what we call mobility as a service. People are getting back into walking and cycling when the climate is conducive to doing that. And increasingly, we're getting much better at producing low carbon buses. The growth of EV buses in China, just as one example, is an incredible story of success. So I think we can be more optimistic that we know how to solve the transport problems. The housing and the food problems are going to take more ingenuity.
Do you think there are other things that we're not thinking about enough?
Well, I think we're not thinking enough about inequality, because what many people are afraid of in cities is crime and insecurity. And there's a lot of data that shows us that the higher the inequality, the more likely there is to be crime. And when there's crime and insecurity, the city loses a key part of its value, because what cities provide to us when they're safe is shared spaces that we all like to enjoy. We like to go to large events in stadiums and in convention centres and museums and theatres. We like to hang out in the Central Park or on the beach. We like to use the main boulevard or the thoroughfare, whatever it is. But if we don't feel safe in the city, that civic experience is taken away from us. So crime and insecurity related to inequality is the thing which I think we're going to have to work on much more than we have been.
Are there particular places that you kind of hold high as being examples for some of the policies, some of the infrastructure, some of the development types which will create a better future for everyone?
Well, I tend to think of this in different income groups. So, if you think about cities in the wealthy part of the world and the nations there, I think the Nordics are obviously very good at all of this. The Scandinavian countries have great cities. They have a good quality of life. They have a way of investing in advance before problems become acute. You could say the same thing about Japan and Korea these days, and say these are two countries who know how to do urbanization well. And you could point to Canadian cities as being really rather good. And in Europe, we should be very proud of German cities and, Austrian cities and Swiss cities and, Polish cities and Spanish cities have become very much better in the last few years. So there's a lot to be sort of enthusiastic about in the rich part of the world. In the middle income part, I mean, we have had this extraordinary last 50 years where China has taken almost 1 billion people out of poverty by enabling almost, 1.2 billion people to live in planned cities. Now, those cities are not all beautiful. They're not all gorgeous. They don't provide the kind of holiday experience you might get in Barcelona or Melbourne, but they are enabling people to move out of poverty and into middle income. And that's going to improve quality of life overall, but it's also going to improve life expectancy. So China has shown the way in a certain way, and I think other middle income countries are beginning to follow. I do a lot of work in Colombia and in Chile and in other countries in Latin America. They're beginning to figure this out. And the eyes of the world, as I say, are going to be on Indonesia and India and Africa. And there's already, I think, some interesting things happening in Southeast Asia and in parts of Africa. I'm really impressed with how Addis Ababa has improved. Nairobi's becoming a better city. Accra is much better organized. So I think that what we've got to do is say that at different levels of income, different things are possible. And at those different levels of possibility, there are some places that should really inspire us. And we've also, of course, got some examples of cities that were really poor 60 years ago, but are now some of the most prosperous in the world. So it's easy to say Singapore is the answer. Not everybody can be Singapore, but Singapore does stand as an example of how you can go from being an impoverished post-colonial island to being one of the top locations in the world. And we need to take the lessons from Singapore and use them widely.
This is like quite a flippant thing to add, but one of the most amazing things about Singapore for me in the last few years has been their use of vegetation, actually. I used to think that Singapore was hell on earth, but when you walk around the streetscapes, the use of sort of tropical vegetation as part of the street design, and it's something that I see now in Miami. You realize that many many kind of assumptions about cities of the future are just wrong. I used to do this thing with Google Images where you type in, what should a future skyscraper look like, or what does a store of the future look like, and Google Images would bring you the results. So now you can ask AI to do this, and what it's essentially doing is finding the kind of cliched average vision for the future. And time again, a vision for the future of cities is cars, it's big, sort of monolithic construction, it's sort of freeways that are elevated. And actually this sort of use of much more organic, much more human scale, much more kind of neighborhood and society driven thinking. That seems to be a really key way to think about a future of cities, which is not sort of a city as a machine, but a city as an organism. What are your thoughts on things like sort of vegetation and other ways to think about cities in a more sort of natural way?
What I would say is what we don't want is robot cities. What we do want is organic cities. And I think there are perhaps three things to say. One, this is a solution to many problems that we have, right? Solutions to flooding, solutions to overheating, solutions to shading. So partly it's a solution to our food requirements as well, but it's certainly a solution to our air quality problems. So many of the problems that we have in cities need solutions that involve bringing nature back. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is actually, I think we're powerless to resist this. I think nature is more powerful than technology. And nature is coming back into cities whether we like it or not. Whether it comes back as a pandemic, or it comes back as an infestation of rats, or it comes back as something else, is, I think, the choice that we have to make. And by reintegrating nature into the city in a way that's intelligent, we're actually doing something that's very good for ourselves and for the planet. So that's really the second point. And then the third point, lastly, I think really importantly, is that nature provides us with a whole set of materials that we can use to actually make our cities much better. I mean, timber is the obvious one, but the ability to use natural processes to recycle water or to extract precious chemicals from, industrial processes, or to use natural processes to actually screen out light. These are all incredibly important for us in terms of pointing the way forward in how our cities should work. And in a way, this is back to the future because, as you will know very well, so many of our cities, I've just been looking at the cities of the Amazon in some detail over the last year or so. So many of the cities were originally fashioned in nature and with nature. It was only the imposition of the industrial city that changed all of that. And I think we need to go back to where we've come from.
Your role is looking at everything. You're looking at technology, you're looking at economics, you're looking at demographics, you're looking at psychology, architecture, zoning, governance. How do you decide how to spend your time?
Well, the thing is that, if you get interested in cities, what you realize is exactly what you've just said.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And therefore, it tends to suit people who like to think on multiple planes at the same time. So I think one way to decide where to focus attention is, what does a certain place need? So I will often go to a city and discover, for example, they have a fantastic transport system, but they haven't figured out yet how to have a vibrant economy. So let's focus on the economy and how do we leverage the transport system? Or we'll go to a city where there's a super economy and people are really, powering away with enterprise, but they haven't built the basic infrastructures to enable them to trade effectively. So I think what you start with is the idea that a really successful city provides all of these things. And that's what the city is for, to be a place of concentration where everything can get served in one place, where all the multiplications, what we sometimes call the co-benefits, Tom, can be there. And so, you need a diagnostic mind. What's working here? What's not working here? How can we use what is working to help what's not working? Where are the deficits we need to catch up? And how can we take confidence from the things we're already good at to solve the problems we haven't yet solved? So every city is not just in a process of evolution, it's also in a process of reforming itself all of the time. And they're very dynamic. Cities are more dynamic than nation states generally. So it's a much more exciting process.
It must be a little bit frustrating in a way, though, because you must get to see such a a strong sense of principles and examples of how magnificent life can be. Like a lot of this stuff isn't new, sort of Jane Jacobs and Defensible Space, or, Richard Rogers, I think in the year 2000 was looking at this. We kind of know the answers, but yet so many cities seem to get it wrong. They're kind of still building roadways that cut up communities. They're still suffering from planning processes. They're incredibly slow. You look at what's happened in LA since the fires and how the bureaucracy is still there. How do you sort of manage that frustration in a way?
Well, that in a way is the quest, isn't it? And you go to bed at night thinking, on balance, was today a good day or a bad day? Did we see him more bad than good, more good than bad? But in the end, I think what you have to do is say, this is about the future of the human race.
Oh.
Are we going to be able to manage and maintain our habitat in ways that will support life when we've gone? And at least in my version of the world, that's about being attentive to our cities and wanting to help the people who lead our cities and to invest in our cities to get things right. So it's a sharing of knowledge and ideas and expertise. And it's appealing not just to people's hearts and minds, which is important, but appealing to their sense of the future. I often say to people, our task is to become good ancestors. And if we can become good ancestors, it means we bequeath a better city to the next generation than the one we inherited. I think that's the task for all of us, Tom, in every walk of life.
Where is your favorite place in the world? Is there a particular square or boulevard or situation that you've sat and you've thought, this is everything a city should be?
Well, it's more personal than that. I think my favourite place in the world is probably Lincoln's Inn Fields in central London, just because it's a place I went to a lot as a kid and I loved it. And I like the fact that it's, next door to the London School of Economics where I teach sometimes. And it's sort of halfway between the City of London and Westminster. And it's a place where people who live in the area go and play sports at lunchtime, netball and tennis. And people who work in the area go and sit there and drink a coffee and eat their sandwich. And it's a place really where you can see people who are very lofty lawyers, patronizing the same space as people who live in local council flats who are going to play a bit of sport. So there's something about Lincoln's Inn Fields that I think really appeals to me. It shows me that idea of cities as a platform, cities as an equalizer, cities as a sharing space is still possible. So I love that spot.
I think this has been a very optimistic discussion. I've loved it. So we don't need to end on a hopeful thing. But of all the things that you're looking into, whether it's new technologies, whether it's new policies, what specific thing gives you the most hope for the future?
It's an interesting question. And actually, the answer is really clear to me. We, I think, in the last couple of decades, have figured out what the task of city leadership actually is. In the past, we thought that the job of the mayor was to be ceremonial, to cut the tape or just to chair the meetings of the council. What we've now realized is that with this mass urbanization that I'm predicting, the role of the city leader has suddenly become one of the most important jobs in the world. And there hasn't been any training for it. People who become city leaders, some of them are plumbers, some of them are bakers, some of them are teachers, they're all sorts of people. But we've now realized that this is a job that has a skill set that matters. You have to be a leader of a team. You have to be able to give people a compelling vision. You have to build alliances. You have to be able to manage well the things you are in charge of and influence well the things you're not in charge of. So we've really started to teach and to train people to be city leaders. And with the help particularly of Michael Bloomberg and his philanthropy, many, many, many more city leaders all around the world are now being trained for the task that they face. And people who are young politicians or young professionals who might want to be city leaders in the future are now being helped to see what the job involves. So that's the thing I think that gives me the most optimism, that in the future, the people who lead our cities will actually be equipped for this very complex task.
I love it. That was a very unexpected answer, but a very profound one. Greg Clark, it's been fantastic having you on this show. Thank you so much for everything.